If I press this, I think it will do something. Okay, so dilemmas and tough choices. So my job is try and set this up as a conversation. And what I've done, I've asked my good friend and colleague Lee to come along from SSP and talk about how one organisation has responded to some of these strategic challenges and used some of the approaches and some of the tools I'm talking about. So you'll get a rather different approach perhaps than advertised, but my experience as a practitioner of these things is it was always more interesting to listen to the practitioner than to the theorist. So I'll be short, and Lee's got more interesting things to say. So what are we for this morning? Well, it's 11:30, so I think we're a gin and tonic before lunch. So you'll get this heady mix of thinking, sparkling applied practice from Lee, cocktail of ideas about a function, in my views, on the rocks. And, of course, we are the couple of lemons who are going to come your way. Now, I'm going to start with we're on the rocks in learning and development. I think we are. And I think we're on the rocks because we're sitting holding, in this generation, the consequences of a history in the last 30 years, since I've been in business, of incredible change, in which what's really interesting, if you look at schools, if you look at universities, you look at business schools that I used to run, and you look at learning and development, learning hasn't changed anything like as fast or anything like as dynamically as the rest of society in which learning takes place. And if, like me, you're a parent, which of course is all about managing exercise in failure, but if you are a parent and you've parented your children, you're parenting your children through education, you'll realise increasingly actually how far out of touch some of education practice is to the sorts of choices and dilemmas that are facing young people today. Well, my observation about learning and development in organisations is it can at times be equally out of touch with the learning choices and dilemmas faced by the people we employ today. So, are we surprised that we're struggling a bit? So let me try and explain that. It all used to be so easy. Certainly when I started, you stood up, you had your standard kit, you talked for ages, people took notes, they had a manual. Do you remember going, manuals, training courses? I used to have hundreds of the bloody things on my shelves. They're all the answers. And the great thing about the manual was it stayed on the shelf. It never got opened again. And actually the problem with e-learning is it stays in the computer and it never gets reopened again. So technology is not an answer to easy. It might be part of an answer. But what's gone on to make it quite as difficult today as we are finding it? So I think it's around these 5 things, and let me try and explain. The first is, since the 80s, we have gone through 3 major recessions. And each time we've gone through a recession in business and public sector, we've done more to take away the infrastructure of learning and development than probably of any other activity in business. So I started in business in the Stone Age in the early 80s, and most of us still had training centres. Big businesses had big places where people used to go to in-house training programs. Can you think of anyone who has a training centre today? That whole investment in the infrastructure, the environment of learning went. And it went in the first recessions in the late 70s and early 80s. The second thing that's changed because of the recessions is we used to have training teams. We used to have sales training teams. We used to have trainers. We used to have people in training departments. Occasionally you still see training departments, probably more in the public sector than the private sector. But as a result of the 90s, most of us don't have training departments. We don't have in-house trainers. In fact, the vast majority of you will manage training delivery on an outsource or a consulting basis. You might have 1 or 2 good HR people who turn their hands to being quite entertaining in front of a crowd. But actually, in terms of professional training expertise, it's in very short supply in organisations today. So we have to bring people in and we have to educate them in our culture, our business, in how things work, in order to let them loose on the people we want them to have some sort of impact on. And the issue with the last recession is, I suspect, that an awful lot of us are now thinking about it's not just the end of the training centre, it's not just the end of the training team, it's probably the end of learning and development and training as we've seen it. A large number of organisations in the private sector in the last 2 to 3 years just have done no training at all apart from what is compliance. How do we know that? Well, you want to look at corporate training receipts in business schools, you want to look at the number of corporate training companies that have gone bust or have significantly slimmed down. And you know that because your budgets have been hit and because your ability to invest and develop to support the business is severely hit. So we've got ourselves to a point over the last 30 years where we're hugely threatened in learning and development, and it doesn't seem to have the perceived value and buy-in perhaps it did from senior management 30 years ago. I'm generalising to make a point. There are always exceptions, but it feels like it's more difficult. The second thing that's happened to us is technology. Technology is happening in two ways. First is the impact of digital technology on the world of work. Again, if you go back to my Stone Age business starting, the most exciting thing that happened to us was a telex. You remember what a telex was? If you don't, ask someone who's laughing. And then it got really exciting when it became a fax. But you still got communication, you still got things to react to over time. Now, with email, you get hundreds of these instant communications hitting your desk every day. Perhaps, for some of you, every half day. Huge amounts of deal with me now information that's appearing. And what's really interesting is that's changed the role of management, and it's changed the role of business leadership or public sector leadership in a way that says the first thing you have to develop is a whole set of filtering skills to know how to react to deal with me now messages. So digital technology itself, before it gets to learning, has started to shift the challenges of being in an organisation quite dramatically, and has driven a whole lot of thinking around, I don't have time. I can't be away from my desk. How many of you have got Blackberries or iPhones? Stick your hands up. Okay. How many of them are off just at the minute? Keep your hand up. Yes. Silent is not off, madam. It is on. Because it vibrates gently in your groin. It's not your handbag. Okay? The problem for this is we're even here. We've come to learn. We've come to reflect. But every now and then, if it gets boring, we'll take a quick look at the phone. How on earth can you start to build reflective cultures and reflective thinking in organisations where the need is to be instantly available and instantly respond? So technology itself in the workplace has made it much more difficult to learn, and then technology in learning has come along, whether it's an LMS or an e-learning system, has come along as the solution to being able to learn at your desk. Well, learning at your desk is always a challenging experience. I think it's very difficult to do and do well, partly because of the need to reflect and the environment in which you need someone to hold the mirror up occasionally and say, gosh, did you just see what you've done or how you've done it? But it's also very difficult because what you're doing is basically, with a lot of these systems, is all they've done is replace the manual and stuck it on the screen. And even if there's a bit of interactive video just to make you feel good, it's really still hugely one way. So we're back with the Blackboard. Interestingly, one of the big learning systems is called Blackboard. And we're back with transmitting. So technology has not necessarily been hugely positive or hugely enabling of great learning or understanding what learning is about. The third is thinking about being learner-centric. I think it's interesting where the sort of old-fashioned LMSs and e-learning systems is that when you put them in front of a whole organisation and you get people to engage with it and you say, this is available to you, roughly, in my experience, I've done it twice, roughly about 15% of the population actually bother to go in and complete what it is you're trying to do. Now, is that surprising? Well, it's not when you think about Honey and Mumford's learning styles. Pragmatist, activist, theorist, reflector. 85% of the work population are pragmatists and activists in their learning. and 15% are theorists and reflectors. And the theorists and reflectors will head for the book or head for the screen quite happily, while the activists and pragmatists are going to say, well, that's what I do. Can I do something? Can I experience this in a way that enables me to learn differently? So why on earth did we think that technology-centric learning was going to work for the vast majority of people in an organisation? And one of the things that I've noticed in schools, I've certainly noticed having run a major business school and a part of, after we merged with Reading, a major university business school, was in fact most of our learning approaches to children and to young people as well as to adults don't start with a learner. And you think about how we as consumers now feel about how we want to engage through digital media, how we want to engage and create the news, how we want to engage with, as a customer, we want it to be highly individualised. We go to places that are customer-centric. We value that sense of being taken as the most important person in the room. And yet we still sit in environments where we learn, where it's producer-centric. And boy, let me tell you, business school academics are incredibly producer-centric, because they will sit here and tell you what they know and they think you should know. Why do we think learning is becoming more difficult? Human capital movement hasn't helped us either. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, the problem with human capital for me, and one or two of you might have read some of the articles I've written, which may be accused of ranting about it occasionally, but one of the things that human resources as a function has done, which I think is shooting itself in the foot, is try to adopt the language of the accountant. Our job is to be the bursar of people. It's to think about people, their relationships, how they relate to work, how they relate to each other, how they perform, how they're motivated, how they're engaged. It's not to think about numbers. That's what accountants do. And by adopting the language of the accountants, we merrily went off down the track of then having someone say, well, you must be able to produce a return on investment measure for a training program. What a daft idea. Either you're going to spend an awful lot of money coming up with the answer 42, which is what most ROI projects do around training, or you end up being caught by the accounting mentality in organisations, which is, well, I can't actually do that. So you find yourself on the back foot, defending, well, actually, if I can't prove that it has this return, perhaps I should put this money and put it somewhere else where I can measure it. And yet we know as a society that investing in skills and knowledge of our people generates economic prosperity. That is proven over 100, 150 years of introducing universal education. So why do we have to suddenly put ourselves through hoops of fire in this human capital world to prove that spending 100,000 on a particular training program or whatever it is good value for money? And then we've been scuppered by the talent myth. So the talent myth, McKinsey's proposition that you only need to invest in a few great people because they're so brilliant, they'll take the rest of the organisation with them in their performance, invent things called collateralised debt obligations and nearly bring the world's financial system down, that proposition. And what's been really interesting to me in the way that company boards and public sector boards have responded to the talent myth is they bought the proposition that said you can take your learning dollars and put them behind a much smaller group of people because you will get a much bigger return. So many organisations now find the budgets are restricted to high potentials, leadership development, top-end development. It's easier to get money for that than it is for basic line manager and supervisory training, for example. And yet, what do we know about engagement theory? Anyone will tell you that the most important thing about getting people engaged, i.e. willing and able to put in the discretionary effort that improves your company performance, your organisation performance, is that they think they are really well managed. So the best investment you can make, in my view, is to invest in line manager training. Because the more people in your organisation are well managed, the more they're going to perform well. Not well led, but well managed. And yet, we've seen the money in the last 10 years since McKinsey published their first paper shoot its way from wide training impact to narrow and narrow impact in specific groups. I think if you put those things together, you start to understand why many of us are finding it so difficult to persuade people to find the resources, to get them allocated, to get people to believe that it's going to make a difference. And what if we take people offside, just talk with them for 2 days? That's not going to be great, is it? So partly things that have happened in our own function, partly things that have happened outside. And it's produced these dilemmas. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong way. So what do? I use dilemma quite deliberately. A dilemma, as defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, says that you've got one of two choices, either of which has a rather nasty sting in the tail for somebody somewhere. That's why it's a dilemma. It's not an easy choice to make. And choice is important because the concept of choice and how you as an organisation choose to do things and what you choose to do says a huge amount about you as an employer and as a responsible member of your community. My favourite modern philosopher is a man called Albus Dumbledore. And at the end of the second Harry Potter book, which is Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Harry discovers that he has the same skills or capabilities, as if you like, as Voldemort, who, as you know, is the villain of the piece. And it's Dumbledore, who's Harry's headmaster, who turns around to him and says, you know, it's our choices that show people who we truly are, far more than our abilities. And that's not just true for individuals, but it's true for organisations as well. So what are you going to choose to do? So the dilemmas that come out of this last 30 years are, do you spend on the many, or do you spend on the few? Do you buy the McKinsey myth? Do you invest in the organisation, or do you invest in the individual? They're not necessarily one and the same things. Do you think about self-directed learning as the answer to try and increase the impact you have with limited resources? Or do you say, no, it's really important we invest in development activity. We drive the agenda. You don't drive the agenda. Business delivery versus business development. Are you investing in, we need to do this, we have to have health and safety, we need new people to be inducted into the organisation? Or do you think that it's important to look 3 to 5 years down the line and be able to invest in the strategic capabilities you need as the business develops for the longer term? These are tough choices with limited resources. And are you going to outsource it, or are you going to keep things in-house? So I think the choices need to be thought about in these 5 areas. One is, as I've just said, for me, line managers deliver the biggest bang for your buck as an organisation. You know that. People join the company, they leave the manager. Really, really good line management keeps your best people and develops your best people. Poor line management gives you high recruitment, big churn problems, and morale problems, performance problems. Being behind the organisation and thinking about organisation requirements does bring strategic relevance. One of the biggest challenges I think learning and development has is to put itself in the strategic space where it's an investment to deliver a business goal. And hopefully Lee will pick that up as he talks about it. Self-directed learning, on the other hand, is really interesting because it helps people take responsibility for their own learning. One of the problems with those major big programs we all went on with the manuals was actually we didn't have to do the learning. We were passive learners. So can you use self-directed learning for active involvement? Business development is all about delivering strategic long term. We have to be able to invest in the future, not just in today. And I think on outsourcing, it's about judging what's routine and can be commoditized in training and development, and what is competitive advantage that you wish to sustain and build and keep within the organisation. So, for example, in many organisations, the ability to manage projects successfully is a huge differentiator between success and failure. The ability to train people in health and safety probably isn't, because loads of people do it well, and you could probably buy it far more effectively outside from someone who does it all the time, for example. So, this is me going to finish and hand over to Lee. What I think the future looks like. One of the things that has worried me over the last 10 years or so is the shift away in social values, as well as in the workplace, from the importance of developing yourself after formal education. 30 years ago, we were the country of night classes, of active development, of people interested in learning languages, reading philosophy, doing whatever. And increasingly in our digital age, when there's so much more available, 141 channels of not very good television instead of 4, for example, all that distraction, the rise of the computer gaming, huge great sort of leisure opportunities, all of that has crowded out the importance for a lot of people of investing in themselves. Yet if you don't invest in yourself now, for yourself, not me as your employer doing that, you won't have a job in 10 years' time, because you'd have just fallen behind younger, newer, more interested people in your sector, in your profession. And it is quite interesting that in the general management, where there is no professional requirement for CPD, there is no discipline around continuing to be up to date. And yet, who of us would go to a doctor or a surgeon that we didn't think understood the latest techniques in our field? And yet, individually, society is less interested in self-development. Somehow, as organisations, we've got to put that back in front of people to say, if you don't buy into this opportunity, your career, your future, your opportunities won't be as great as they could be. You need to provide access to the opportunity. We need to think about what are the capabilities for long-term strategic success and put our learning and development agenda behind those rather than behind the routine activity. We need to think about personal development and organisational development. If you can't answer the question, what's in it for me, doing this programme you want me to do for the organisation, you won't get the emotional engagement where people want to change. We rarely sell big programmes that the organisation wants with what's in it for me. We tell everybody what's in it for the organisation. We've got to think about turning that around. We've got to think about different pathways to learning. A course, a programme isn't the answer, just as a complete e-learning answer isn't the answer. Blending it appropriately, allowing people to manage their own learning, not controlling learning, strikes me as important. And finally, engaging learners and supporting the learners' learning of others. One of the things that the good learners in our organisation aren't encouraged to do is to help other people learn and learn effectively. It's quite daunting if you weren't a brilliant learner in younger life to become a great learner. It's actually quite easy when you work out how. And encouraging and empowering people in organisations to build learning as a culture strikes me as the final big challenge. So, I'm going to hand over to Lee.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. We're going to hold questions until after both speakers have finished. So if you do